You grab a handful of fries. You tell yourself it's just a snack. But your hand keeps going back into the box, again and again, until there's nothing left but grease-stained paper. You didn't plan to eat all of it. Something in your brain planned it for you. For nearly all of human history, salt was scarce. Your body evolved to crave it, because finding it meant staying alive. Ancient trade routes were built around it. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in it. But somewhere in the last 50 years, salt stopped being rare, and the food industry turned that ancient craving into a science. So how did a simple mineral become one of the most carefully engineered ingredients on the planet? Let's find out. In the 1970s, food companies began hiring a researcher named Howard Moskowitz. He wasn't trying to make food taste good. He was trying to make it irresistible. Moskowitz tested dozens of versions of the same product, adjusting salt, sugar, and fat levels slightly each time, then plotted the results on a graph. Somewhere on that curve sat a peak, a precise point where a food tasted maximally pleasurable without ever tipping into too much. He called it the Bliss point. Push past it, and your brain flags the food as unpleasant. Land exactly on it, and your brain quietly says, again. This wasn't guesswork. It was math. Food scientists could calculate, almost to the gram, the exact amount of salt required to keep you reaching for more. Here's what's actually happening on your tongue. Taste receptors detect sodium and fire a signal straight into your brain's reward circuitry, the same pathways involved in motivation and pleasure. A small hit of salt doesn't just improve flavor, it creates a tiny spike of desire for another bite. Multiply that spike across an entire bag of chips, and you get a feedback loop your ancestors never had to resist, because for them, salt simply ran out. Picture a food lab decades ago. Rows of small paper cups, each holding a slightly different version of the same snack. A panel of tasters moves down the line, scoring each one. Behind a one-way mirror, a formulator adjusts the recipe again, chasing the exact peak on Moskowitz's curve. This wasn't a fringe experiment. It became the standard method across the entire packaged food industry. Journalist Michael Moss spent years investigating this world, interviewing former insiders who described entire teams dedicated to optimizing salt, sugar, and fat. One executive admitted their products weren't nutritionally necessary. What mattered was that people couldn't stop eating them. Internal memos he uncovered described the goal in blunt terms: maximize craveability. But why does salt specifically work so well on your brain? At the Monell Chemical Senses Center in Philadelphia, sensory scientist Paul Breslin and his colleagues have spent years studying how humans perceive sodium. Their research shows your appetite for salt isn't fixed. It shifts depending on how much you've been eating. The more salt you regularly consume, the more it takes to satisfy that same craving. The target keeps moving, and industrial food keeps chasing it further away from you. Now, here's the twist. You'd expect the saltiest foods to be the obvious ones: pretzels, salted nuts, things where you can see the crystals. But some of the most sodium-loaded items in the average diet don't taste salty at all. Bread, cereal, sauces. A single fast food meal can carry more sodium than your body needs in an entire day, without ever registering as salty on your tongue. That's intentional. If a product tastes overtly salty, your brain's built-in alarm tells you to stop. But hide that same sodium inside something sweet or savory, and it slips past that warning system completely. You keep eating well past the point where an obviously salty food would have made you pause. That's the marketing lie hiding underneath the science. You believe you're simply choosing what you like. In reality, you're often responding to a formula engineered to slip past the exact signal your body evolved to protect you. And it isn't just about hiding sodium from your tongue. Formulators also learn to pair salt with sugar and fat in specific ratios, because the three together create a stronger pull than any one of them alone. A salty sweet snack can bypass your body's natural enough signal more effectively than a purely salty one, because sugar and fat activate their own separate reward pathways at the same time. Layer 3 cravings on top of each other, and stopping becomes a genuinely harder task for your brain, not a simple failure of self-control. So, what is all of this doing to you right now, meal after meal? Your kidneys work overtime to flush the extra sodium. Over years, that steady overload is linked to higher blood pressure, since sodium pulls extra water into your bloodstream and forces your heart to work harder. Researchers tracing back to physiologist Louis Dahl in the 1960s were already connecting higher salt intake to hypertension across entire populations, decades before most packaged food companies changed a single recipe. And it reshapes more than your arteries. It reshapes your expectations. If you grew up eating heavily engineered, salt-optimized food, a fresh vegetable or an unsalted home-cooked meal can taste strangely flat to you, not because it lacks flavor, but because your palate has been recalibrated by years of formulas built around the bliss point. Here's the part that should genuinely give you hope. Your sense of taste is not permanent. Studies on sodium reduction have found that when people cut back for a few weeks, their taste receptors reset. Foods that once tasted bland start tasting normal again. Foods that once tasted normal can suddenly taste almost unbearably salty. The craving isn't a fixed trait carved into your biology. It's a dial, and industrial food has spent decades quietly turning it up. That means it's also a dial you can turn back down. Think about how strange this would look to someone from just a few generations back. Salt used to be something you rationed carefully. Before refrigeration existed, people packed meat and fish in it to keep them from spoiling. Camel caravans crossed the Sahara, loaded with nothing but salt, because a single block could be worth its weight in gold. That ancient craving sitting in your genes right now was built for a world of scarcity. That world never came back. Instead, salt became cheap, abundant, and eventually, industrialized. The shift didn't happen overnight. Early canned and packaged foods needed salt mainly for preservation, long before anyone studied the psychology behind craving it. French inventor Nicolas Appert pioneered food preservation techniques in the early 1800s, and salt was one of his key tools for keeping food shelf-stable. For over a century, salt in food was mostly about survival against spoilage. It wasn't until food science matured in the 20th century that companies realized salt wasn't just a preservative. It was a lever, and pulling it the right amount meant people bought more. Picture a corporate test kitchen sometime in the 1970s. A simple product, maybe a canned soup, gets sent back for reformulation. Consumer panels rated the original as just okay. A new version, with slightly more sodium, scores dramatically higher. Nobody in that room needed a background in neuroscience. They just needed the number to climb. That's the quiet, spreadsheet-driven reality behind what can sound like a conspiracy. It wasn't a secret meeting in a smoky room. It was market research, repeated and refined across an entire industry until it became standard practice. Now consider what happens the moment sodium hits your tongue. The signal travels along your taste nerves into your brainstem, and from there, into regions deep in your brain tied to reward. The same pathways activated by things your biology considers essential. Sugar and fat trigger overlapping circuits too. But salt carries something the other two don't. For nearly all of human evolution, it was the one thing your body could never make on its own, or pull from a piece of fruit. You had to go find it. That deep wiring is exactly what modern food formulas learn to trigger on command, meal after meal. So the next time a bag of chips somehow empties itself in your hands, remember what's actually happening. You're not weak. You're not lacking willpower. You're responding to decades of laboratory-tested engineering built by people who understood your taste buds better than you understood them yourself. The bliss point wasn't stumbled upon by accident. It was found on purpose, tested on thousands of people, and built directly into the product sitting in your hand right now. You grab a handful of fries. This time, you know exactly why your hand keeps going back for more.